With the wonderful Cole Moreton, who's going to tell us about Everything is Extraordinary. So, Cole Moreton.
Crumbs.
Do that. Hang on.
Okay, steady tiger, here we go. Sorry.
Technical difficulties. Wasn't that great? Do you know, I remember that ad. I do. It's like a flashback. How incredible. What have we got? Anybody know where this is? Go on then, where is it? Which hill did you say? Moreton Hill, I mean. Yeah, it is. It is up on Moreton Hill. It's gorgeous, isn't it? I mean, Everything is Extraordinary. That is a really daft title at a time when the world is full of woe, isn't it? And sorrow and suffering. And it's patently not true as well. So, what am I doing and what am I going to talk about? I will answer that in a minute, towards the end. But I want you, for a moment, to think about the answer to a question that I'm going to ask you. Just the first person that comes into your head. Okay? Who's the most extraordinary person you've ever met? Just hold that thought in your head for a minute. Could be a mum, could be the milkman, could be somebody who did a wonderful act of kindness for you, could be a stranger. Just think about them for a second. I want to tell you about something extraordinary that I was witness to. And in a way, I'm going to start by talking about this because one of the lovely things about coming back to the Bavard Bar is that I did the first talk at the first one ever in Eastbourne, upstairs in Printers. Was anybody here for that? Yeah, wasn't it good? A tight little space, but we had a lovely time. This is much more comfortable here, isn't it? And I talked about this thing that I'm about to talk about, but I wanted to bring it back because of coming back, but also just to kind of demonstrate something. So if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, I would invite you to make a fist. And then put your fist on your chest where you think your heart might be. The doctors among us should know the answer to that, you would hope. Although, judging by the accident investigation stats, I'm not so sure. And then open up your hand so that the palm of your hand is on your chest. And just for a moment, if you want to, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and see if you can sense or feel your own heart beating inside your chest. And then, not to get too woo-woo about it, although Tim's set a high bar already tonight, think about the people sitting next to you. Try and become aware of the people sitting next to you on either side of you, and think about their hearts beating too. Now, you can open your eyes if you like, but keep your hand where it is. I want to tell you about a thing that happened about 7 years ago, where I was in a room with a woman called Sue, and Sue had lost her son, Martin, who had an aneurysm and suddenly died in the middle of the night. It was a terrible thing. He was 16 years old and he fell down dead in their house in Grantham and was taken to hospital where they declared him dead. And Sue and her husband Nigel had already agreed that should anything happen to any of them, they would allow organs to be harvested. It was a way of dealing with the grief, and it comforted them at the time that those organs might be useful. The boy's name was Martin, and he was 16 years old, and his heart was taken from his body and put in an icebox, a bit like you might use for a picnic. And it was rushed from Grantham to Newcastle, where there was another boy waiting, Mark, who was 16 years old. And he had heart failure, and the only thing that could save him was a heart transplant. So they rushed Martin's heart in a police car, and then in a plane, and then another police car to the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle, where it was delivered to the operating theatre in this box, and it was lifted out of the box. Now, in that situation, the heart is frozen and blue and hard, and the wonderful surgeon, Leslie, who did the operation, said, oh, it's just a bit of plumbing, really. Took 12 hours, I think, something like that. He put the heart into Mark's body, took out the failing one already, and then connected the valves, and then opened the valves so that the blood flowed into the heart. And his description of it was that the blood flows into the heart and warms it, and it slowly turns red, and then this miracle, as he described it, happens, which is that because of a chemical reaction in the heart, suddenly there is natural electricity that causes the heart to twitch, and then after a few moments it twitches again, and then again, and it starts to twitch regularly, and then the heart is beating. Mark was saved by that heart, and 13 years later he was in a hotel room in Scotland with me and a producer, Jonathan Mayo. We were making a programme for Radio 4, and Sue came into the room and sat down on the sofa next to Mark, and we invited her to do something that she'd always wanted to do. And she sat down very closely to Mark on the sofa. She was nervous. She'd met him before, but she was nervous at the moment. And then she reached out and put her hand on his chest, and this woman who'd lost her son when he was 16 years old, under the palm of her hand, very softly, very distantly, but then more strongly, felt the heart of her lost son beating inside this boy who had become a man. And then she gave a nervous little giggle and shuffled down the sofa, because, you know, it's too much to bear sometimes, isn't it? Now, you can take your hands off your chest if you like. You can keep them there if it comforts you, but I'm talking about all this because by telling that story, by inviting you to think about your own heart, your own body, and think about the bodies of the people next to you, and think about Martin, and think about Mark, and think about Sue, and imagine perhaps putting yourself into their position, wondering what it would be like. All of a sudden, there is a little bit of a different atmosphere in the room. There's a little bit more of a sense of connection between people. Tentatively, maybe, because we're strangers, but, you know, we're in a different place than we were 5 minutes ago. And we've made a simple connection. Everything is Extraordinary is the title of a collection of stories that I've put together from encounters I've had with extraordinary people over the last 25 years in my work as a writer and broadcaster. And some of those people are insanely famous. Some of them you will never have heard of, but they have remarkable stories to tell or insights to share. And in each case, I look back at meeting Scarlett Johansson, Tiger Woods, the Queen, Nelson Mandela, a refugee called Zara, a food bank worker called Sherry, and give each of them the same kind of level of treatment, treat each of them equally, and ask what can we learn about making human connections when we meet people, when we listen. What happens when we listen to people properly, when we look at their body language, when we set ourselves aside and really listen one-to-one and see each other for who we are rather than what we can do for each other. I'd love to tell you them all. Oh look, there's the book cover. I'll come back to him. But I'm going to give you a choice for a choice of 3 quick stories. You can have a story about taking my mum to meet the Queen and meeting a ghost on the way. You can have a story about Zara, who crossed the channel on a flimsy rubber boat in the early hours of one Christmas morning after a 7,500 mile journey that reads like something from an epic folk tale, and is now, they will be delighted to hear, learning to fly. Or you can have a story about going on a date with her. That's Scarlett Johansson. For a moment, I thought it was a date anyway. It might not have actually been a date. So which one do you want? Let's have a show of hands. Who wants the Queen? Okay, how quickly we forget. Who wants Zara? Oh, okay, that's interesting. And who wants Scarlett? Okay, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Okay, so I'll give you a one-sentence summary of what happened with the others, and then we'll go to Zara. So, with the Queen, I was the first person for 500 years to spend the night in the Thomas More crypt cell at the Tower of London. And during the night, I had an encounter with something while I was reading out the last letter that Thomas More wrote to his daughter when he was about to be executed. I was reading it by candlelight, making a video, and there was a presence in the room. And because I did that, raised a lot of money through the newspaper for the restoration of the chapel there, and then they invited me to go and attend the rededication. And at that rededication, there were about 30 of us there, including my mum and Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. It was really rude. That's a shock, isn't it? What was the other one? Scarlett. Oh yeah, Scarlett. Oh, Scarlett. Well, you get 15 minutes with Hollywood superstars, and usually in the company of a publicist in a hotel room. But she turned up at this bar in the Carlisle Hotel on the Upper East Side, and was in that room with me on her own, with nobody else, for getting on for 3 hours. And I couldn't figure it out. And all the time, I should have asked the obvious question, like, why are you staying here with me? But my inner chimp got the better of me, and I started to believe it was because she fancied me, despite the obvious evidence, right? And I was dazzled by, regardless of that kind of thing, when you're getting attention from someone that famous, who you've just seen 100 foot high in a billboard on Times Square, that it's dazzling. And if I'd got myself out of the way and asked the obvious question, then I would have found out what she was doing there that day. Which I'm not going to tell you, because I want you to get the book. Although, to be honest, you could probably just Google the interview that I did and you'll find out the answer. Or you can listen to the podcast, which is called Can We Talk? I told that story there. Finally, though, Zara. Let's go back to her. Okay, so Zara was born in Tehran. Her parents were refugees from Afghanistan, where her father had opposed the Taliban, and she grew up there in really, really difficult circumstances. It's really very hard for people there who come from where she came from. But when she was growing up, she had this attraction to the planes that were flying overhead. She was fascinated by them. It was the idea of these beautiful things in the clear blue sky, but it was also the idea of freedom and escape from her circumstances. And eventually, when she was about 15 or 16, their lives in Tehran became untenable, and they had to leave, along with many other people who became refugees from Tehran at that time. They had to leave, and they began a journey which, when she told me about it, seemed to me to be so resonant with all those old stories that we have about how the hero or heroine has to leave a place and go in search of peace and calm or something that will save their community, and they have to overcome obstacles, and they have to defeat tricksters, and they have to cross great swathes of countryside. She did all of that over a long period of time and a long amount of miles, a lot of miles. Firstly, her and her mum walked across the mountains to Turkey, which, it's not the Seven Sisters. And then they took a boat across to Lesbos at a time when people were paying people smugglers to get them onto boats. But those people smugglers, it's not a luxurious thing. They were being poked with cattle prods to make sure they got on the boat in these really difficult and dangerous waters. And this was around the time that poor young boy was discovered, if you remember that picture, washed up on the beach. So she made it to the other side, with her mum, and they found themselves in a refugee camp in Lesbos. And Zara was about 15, and after a while in the camp it became obvious that there was an issue with some of the men around. Now, in all these stories, you get, in those ancient folk stories, you've got the trickster, and you've also got the kind of wolves that circle around, haven't you? And some of those men in that camp were the wolves. And Zara's mum thought, I've got to get her out of here. So they got together the money that they had, and she made a journey, and she had family connections in England, so they decided that she should strike out for there. And so she got across Europe, she got to Paris. In Paris she met some people who spoke the same language, and they said you should go to Dunkirk. At Dunkirk she met a guy who said, no problem, I'll get you across, I'll get you a boat like that, and he pointed to a ferry. He said, oh, it'd be big, lots of comfort, lots of food, no problem, give me all your money. Another wolf. She gave him all her money, and in the middle of the night found herself being taken in a minibus to a beach outside Calais, a remote beach with about a dozen others. And they got down to the water's edge, and the waves were crashing because it was not a kind night at that point. And the people smuggler brought this large wooden box out of the van, plonked it on the beach, and said, there's your boat. They had to blow it up themselves. And then he pointed to a teenager who'd been a fisherman back home, and he said, right, you take the engine, head for those 4 red lights. And those 4 red lights were the beacon at Dover. And they set off across this stretch of water on December the 24th. There are all kinds of symbolic resonances there with refugees and people going into exile, but I'll leave them to hang in your head. And they got across. I asked a fisherman to take me out there to show me what it was like, and it's terrifying out there in the middle of the shipping lanes. The tankers are like leviathans ready to mow you down. If you're in a tiny little boat, it's really terrifying. But they made it across to the other side, and they got out at dawn on Christmas Day, and they ran down the beach. They didn't know what to do next, but somebody actually had seen them and came down, and Zara braced herself for the kind of assault that she'd had often in France. She'd been beaten by a lot of French policemen over the previous few months and treated with hostility, but she found when she got there that actually somebody was helping her, both in the border force and also in the people that she met afterwards, because she was a teenager. I met her not just because she was a teenager. There are kind people in those forces. Excuse me. I met her through a group called Kent Refugee Action Network, because if you're a teenager, 14 to 18, you don't get put into foster care, you don't get dispersed like an adult, you get sent into like cluster flats where you all live together with people that you don't know, and you have to try and adjust to the place that you found yourself, and so Kent Refugee Action Network help you to do that. And that's where I met Zara, and that's where she told me her story and asked if I would tell it for her, which I have done. And Zara found people helping her. She started to learn English, she started to connect with people here, and then an extraordinary thing happened. Bridget, the woman who runs Kent Refugee Action Network, or did then, went on holiday to Greece, and there was a mess up with her travel company, and her flight got cancelled, and she was very angry about it, and so she complained a lot on social media. If you ever cross anybody, don't make it Bridget, because she makes a right old noise. And the managing director of the company said, look, who the hell are you, and will you shut up, please? And while he was saying that, he got interested in the work that Bridget did, and he said to her privately, is there anything I can do to help? And there were things that he could do to help, but she also said to him, I've got this refugee called Zara, who has always dreamed of learning to fly. Will you help? Because she hasn't had a lot of breaks, and it would just be great to do something really positive for her. So Zara started to have flying lessons. There she is with one of the planes that she had a lesson in. And then this happened. On the first lesson, they took off from Lyd International Airport, and they flew along the coast. And as they got over Folkestone, Zara could see down onto the beach where she'd come across and landed on Christmas morning. And then the instructor said something that they had no idea what the resonance would be. But they said, because it was her time to have a go, "You're in control now." And so there's Zara above her landing space, having the perspective that she'd always dreamed of, feeling like she was in control. And she wept when she told me that, because it was symbolic of so much in her life. Soon after she told me that, she was given refugee status in this country, which means that she is legal in a country for the first time since she was born. And I asked her, the boys were all sort of making faces, teenage boys around the back of her were making faces at her while we were doing the interview. And I sort of said, "What do they say about you learning to fly?" She said, "Oh, they say I can't do it. Girls don't fly. It's not possible." And I said, "Zara, what do you say to them?" She said, "Watch me fly." It's amazing, amazing woman, and she is doing that. I said I would tell you why the thing is called Everything is Extraordinary, and it has to do, finally, with wherever I put the thing. There we are. This man. Recognise him?
Yes.
Clive James. I grew up in the East End of London in a working class community where we were kind of told that our stories didn't matter and we didn't have the right to tell them. And when I was a teenager, Clive James was a bit of a hero to me because I read his Unreliable Memoir, and realised that he was a bloke who came from nowhere on the other side of the world, who by sheer force of personality and charm and arrogance had managed to bully his way into the British establishment and become a real cultural force here, on television and in books. And when I met Clive, I was a little bit overwhelmed for a couple of reasons, but one of them was that he was about to die. He had got terminal cancer, and being Clive, he'd written a rather lovely poem about it, which he published in The Guardian, about how there was a Japanese maple tree in the garden, but he wouldn't see it come back into blossom because he was about to die. And then, inconveniently, he lived for another 5 years. And I asked him how he felt about that. Bloody embarrassed. But he was housebound in that room there, still laughing, as you can see, and coming to the end of his life, and he knew it. And there's something that his daughter Claire said about those days at the end. She said that because there was very, very little time left, every moment became potentially precious. And because he couldn't go anywhere, every tiny thing became recognised as beautiful. An apple, that blossoming tree, dust motes in sunlight. Everything in that moment at that time became extraordinary to him. And so I wrote the stories and started to think about them as a way of trying to engage with that and thinking, wouldn't it be something if in just a little way we could begin to live like that, see those things, recognise that beauty without having to go what he was going through. Thank you.
Cole Moreton. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Cole. Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous.